Good afternoon and welcome to this Euractiv virtual conference on hydrogen emissions. What implications for the green transition? This program is supported by the Environmental Defence Fund. I'm Brian Maguire. You can follow this discussion at hashtag EA Debates. Please tweet your comments there. Our social media team will interact with you directly. And to ask questions today, we're using Slido. You'll see it on the side of your screen. Use the chat section, use the ask button, and our hashtag today is hydrogen. So hashtag hydrogen for Slido. We will have no female participation on the panel today. We'd like to apologize for that. We had invited, some women had agreed to participate. They weren't able to in the end. So just to be clear, it's always our intention to do that. So the discussion today is focused on the European Union and why it's placed hydrogen at the forefront of its ambitious climate neutrality goals. It aims to harness the potential of hydrogen in various sectors, including industry, transport, and energy production, to help achieve Europe's target of becoming carbon neutral by 2050. However, hydrogen can create several climate challenges depending on how it is produced, managed, and used. To date, hydrogen leakage has been seen as a safety concern. It can cause significant near-term warming by increasing amounts of short-lived greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through chemical reactions. And depending on how much is emitted, anticipated climate benefits can be severely undercut in the near term. Ensuring hydrogen is deployed strategically and effectively is therefore crucial. To discuss the latest science on hydrogen emissions and its implications, we have with us today Jose Bermudez, Energy Technology Analyst at IEA, Steve Hamburg, Chief Scientist at Environmental Defence Fund, and Jan Rosenau, Director of European Programmes and Regulatory Assistance Project. We're going to begin today with a scientific presentation by Steve Hamburg. Steve, are you with us there?
And so I just want to say a few words about the Environmental Defence Fund as we start. It was founded 56 years ago, by a group of scientists who had a strong understanding of the science, but didn't feel like they could have impact. And the issue they were working on was the impacts of DDT on birds of prey. So they hired a lawyer and got together, and EDF has been a science-based organization ever since. We currently work in about 30 countries with 4 core regions: China, India, the US, and the EU. And I just would like to say that Helen Spence-Jackson is our new executive director, and she's based in Brussels. We got involved in thinking about hydrogen as those original founders did because we realized the conversation was missing a critical part of the considerations, which was the issue of hydrogen's indirect effects on the climate. Hydrogen is a strong indirect greenhouse gas, and that was not part of the conversation. As you just said, people were thinking about safety, which is critically important, but we also needed to make sure that we were getting the use of hydrogen correct, and we were going to be able to ensure that we get the benefits that we wanted. The path to decarbonization is littered with well-intentioned missteps. We don't have the time to repeat this again with hydrogen. If I can have the first slide, please. So as was mentioned, hydrogen has impacts on the climate. People often don't recognize that because it's not direct greenhouse gas. So it is not itself changing the energetics of the atmosphere, but hydrogen reacts with hydroxyl radical, OH, and by doing that, it actually reduces the concentration of hydroxyl radical, which is the key way that methane breaks down in the atmosphere. So if we add more hydrogen to the atmosphere, the methane in the atmosphere will stick around longer and have more impacts. And as most of you probably know, methane is a very potent, short-lived greenhouse gas that's responsible for about 30% of the warming we currently experience. And the fastest thing we can do is to reduce methane now to slow the rate of warming in the near term while we reduce our CO2 emissions. And at EDF, Environmental Defence Fund, we've gotten involved in this work as we've been working for 13 years on building an understanding of the emissions of methane around the world. How much is being emitted, where they're coming from, because without that kind of data, we can't reduce methane. And similarly, if we don't have that kind of data, we won't be able to reduce hydrogen emissions either. In addition to the effects on methane, it affects tropospheric ozone near the surface of the Earth. That's also through a series of chemical reactions, which is also an important source of warming. And then if it gets into the upper atmosphere, it produces more water vapor when it breaks down, and that is also a source of warming. Next slide, please. So we can integrate this by thinking about how that hydrogen impacts the climate over time. So if we're thinking about only the very long term, hundreds of years, we're not going to worry a lot about hydrogen because it doesn't persist that long in the atmosphere. The molecule itself lasts a couple of years, but its impacts last about a decade, very comparable to methane, because in fact, its mechanism of impact is related to methane. So over time, those impacts decline, but it's really important that we not just focus, as we said, we care about the near term. Many of our policies are directed towards 2050, and we need to make sure that we are addressing the issues that get us to net zero with no additional warming in that time frame. So what we want to think about is how do we reduce the short-term, near-term impacts while we get the long-term benefits. We have to accomplish two things at the same time if we're going to meet our goals for the climate. There's been a growing effort to look at the science around hydrogen impacts. There's growing consensus on the impact, these global warming potentials, and you see the numbers here. There's a vibrant scientific community now looking at it, which I'm pleased that is occurring. Next slide, please. So there really are two things we need to have. We need to have this scientific consensus on the warming effects, which we are now building and is increasingly robust. And we need to know how much hydrogen is being lost to the atmosphere. Unfortunately, at this point, we have no idea how much hydrogen is being lost to the atmosphere because no one was really paying much attention to it. While it's often said that you wouldn't lose that hydrogen, you wouldn't allow it to go to the atmosphere because it's a valuable product, that doesn't in fact mean that it is not being lost because we don't currently have the instruments to make the measurements to be sure we're not losing it. We have instruments that allow us to make sure the levels of hydrogen are below dangerous thresholds, but there's an enormous gap between those levels that are going to cause safety issues and having no emissions. The estimates of emissions currently are broad and wide. We have a paper, we're happy to send it to you, that was published in the scientific literature that just surveyed every estimate that was out there, and it's dramatically broad in the estimates, and they're really not grounded with good data. So what we've done is started to develop a way to measure it. So we've been working with Aerodyne Research. They've developed the first fast response, high precision instrument that's capable of looking at hydrogen emissions coming from different infrastructure. We will receive the first two instruments next month, and working with several companies around the world, as well as academic researchers, we'll be starting to make the measurements of hydrogen emissions coming from existing infrastructure so we can begin to ground this conversation with empirical data. This is exactly what we needed to do a dozen years ago for methane, and we of course now know a lot and are able to take effective action moving forward. So this lack of knowledge is critical. We need to ensure that policies moving forward recognize that we need these kinds of data, and we really need to make integral to any kind of policy issues. We need to be sure to include the reduction and minimization of those emissions. Next slide, please. So one of the things, how important is hydrogen? Next click. How important is hydrogen relative to its impacts on climate? So we can think about it relative to fossil fuels. Next click, please. And we can compare the production of blue hydrogen, which is going to have associated emissions from methane from upstream production of natural gas, as well as hydrogen from the production and use of it directly. Or green hydrogen, where you're using green electrons to produce the hydrogen, but we also have to worry about losses of hydrogen from the value chain. Next click, please. And if we assume, which is just a rough range, that For methane lost from making blue hydrogen, it could be from 1 to 3% in the supply chain. That's not by any means the maximum. There are places where supply chains in which those emissions are much higher than 3%. There are a few where it's below 1%, but they're very limited. So this represents a sort of middle range. And for hydrogen, we assumed the emissions were from 1 to 10%. And that's, again, a rough range. We know there are systems which are most likely higher than 10%, and they're potentially lower than 1%. But it's important to remember that hydrogen is the smallest molecule. It's very slippery, as they referred to in the chemistry world. And as a result, it's under the physics, based on physics, it's going to leak at a faster rate than methane. It's hard to hold on to. So getting a zero emissions hydrogen system is certainly our aspiration, but it is not going to be something that's going to be easy to accomplish. Next clip, please. So we put this all together to look at the climate effects of a range of emissions associated with production and use of blue hydrogen and production and use of green hydrogen in the near term, over 20 years and over 100 years. And what this figure shows, that if we have high emission scenarios for production of blue hydrogen, it could even be worse than using the fossil fuel in the near term. It could be better than the fossil fuel in the near term, but it's still not going to be 100%. You're going to have climate impacts. With green hydrogen, it's the same story, though better, because you don't have the methane involved. And because it's a short-lived climate pollutant, over time, those impacts become less relative to if we'd use fossil fuels. The key take-home message here is that if we are going to use hydrogen and we don't control emissions, we will greatly undercut the impact of doing so on decarbonization. If we want to realize hydrogen as a powerful tool, we need to make sure we use it in places and in ways that we can minimize these losses, and we can quantify them as we go along, which will now be possible because of new technologies to make those measurements. And that will allow us to effectively utilize hydrogen as a powerful tool. But we have to use it in the right places under the right conditions. So thanks. That's the end of the slides. I would just conclude by we really need to make sure we get this right. We have a powerful tool, but we shouldn't assume it's the effective tool for solving all of our decarbonization problems, but rather it's a tool used in the right place in the right time, as I mentioned, with the right data. We need to go out and collect that data and apply that to this problem. I will mention that the Environmental Defense Fund will have a booth at the European Hydrogen Week in Brussels next week, and encourage folks to step by. Thank you very much.
Steve, thank you so much. That was concise and clear. Great start to the program today. I'm going to ask our other two panelists if they can just do a short introduction as well to the key points they want to get across today, and then we'll go into the discussion. Just to remind you, for Slido, #hydrogen, and you can send your questions in there. Our team will forward those to me. I'll put them to the panel throughout the course of the program. We're not going to bring them all at the end, so you can send them in right now and throughout the course of the discussion. So, Jose, can I ask you to kick off just with your highlights for today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian, and thanks first of all for the invitation to this discussion. I'm really pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss with Steve and John, that I have been following their all their messages over the last few years, and I really delighted to have the opportunity to speak with them. I think Steve has made a great presentation, opening to put us into the topic and what's the challenge, you know. And I want to highlight something that he mentioned, which is that this problem has been quite overseen in the last few years, and the fact that we are having now these conversations and more evidence and more research on the topic, I think these are great news. Because I think that the big problem that we are facing in this challenge is the lack of scientific evidence concretely on the topic of leakage. Even on the global warming potential of hydrogen, this is a topic that has been itself been overseen for quite a while. Actually, if we realize the references that one of the slides that Steve presented, all of them come from the last 2 years, no? But I think now that this is progressing, I think what we really need to act seriously is on the potential problem of leakage. So I think we need to make a really strong effort on collecting information and gathering data and understanding much better the problem in all sorts of equipment that uses hydrogen. And we can think even to the smallest type of equipments, in valves, in pipes, in tanks, in every single piece of equipment that has a joint where hydrogen can leak. And for this, I think we need to step up efforts in two aspects. On one side is on the innovation side. We still don't have the tools that can help us on doing this on a continuous basis on an open field, or at least not an affordable cost. And this is because the hydrogen detectors, which is the first thing that we need for this so far, have been focused more on the safety hazards, and they are fit for measuring levels of hydrogen leakage which are above the flammability limit, no? And here we're speaking about other types of leakages that could be the real problem, which are the really small leakages that we will not detect if they are below the flammability limit. And now we know that there are more research, more innovation on this side, and I think this is all good news. And probably this was spurred by the work that the EDF has done. So kudos for EDF on this. And the other aspect when we need to start working is on regulations. So we need to make sure that companies that enter in this new wave of the hydrogen sector, they prioritize measurements, so the measures to detect and to monitor hydrogen leakage. Same as in the case of what we have done or we are doing today on methane in many parts of the world. Unfortunately, not everywhere. And this is not an easy task because as I said, we still don't have the commercial tools to do this job. So it's difficult then to regulate and to force companies to do things when they don't have the equipment that are commercially available. And I would like to finish with a clarification on this last comparison with the case of methane, because it's something that many people is putting on the table, and I think there is not a great parallelism for a few reasons. First of all, methane is a direct greenhouse gas, something that hydrogen is not. So it produces hydrogen where it is used or where it is leaked, but also in its use because it also generates other potent greenhouse gases, which is not the case of hydrogen. And another thing, I think Steve touched on this point, and maybe this is a point in which we are going to disagree, but that's fantastic because we can learn from each other. Hydrogen, or particularly, and I want to put the spotlight on low emission hydrogen, either green or blue. Normally in the IEA we don't use colors, but for easiness in the discussion, let's use them. Is going to be quite expensive. Sometimes something that methane in many cases is not, or depending on the time, it is or is not. And there is a strong high incentive for companies that are going to make business out of hydrogen to take seriously the issue of leakage. However, even considering this point and even considering that I think that the potential impact of hydrogen on global warming is going to be limited. I think that this cannot be an excuse not to everyone do its own homework. So we really need to learn from the experience on what we have done on natural gas so far and act early on to avoid undesirable situations, even if they seem to be unlikely.
Jan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I mean, I look at this very much from an end user perspective, and I think the points that Steve made and also Jose just show once again that we need to take a very much scientifically informed approach when we think about the potential end users of hydrogen. You know, which sectors should we use hydrogen? We have some very ambitious targets in Europe. 20 million tons of hydrogen, green hydrogen by 2030. 10 million tons to be produced in Europe and the other 10 million tons to be imported. And at times, the debate really seemed like we would be using hydrogen in all of the sectors. We'd use it for cars, for heating, in industry, shipping, aviation. And clearly, that is not going to be a realistic option. And the issue of emissions and
of the global warming potential of hydrogen, I think to me just demonstrates that it's even more important, in addition to the economic and practical considerations around using hydrogen in all these sectors, we now have to take into account the potential impact on climate and on global warming. So it's paramount, I think, that we take an evidence-based approach, that we avoid to focus on end users that clearly are not going to play a major role in the future for hydrogen. Actually, the European Commission's hydrogen strategy and the sector integration strategy are quite clear in prioritizing hydrogen only there where it's absolutely needed, and not focus on technologies such as hydrogen in areas where we have better alternatives. For example, electric vehicles are unlikely to lose the race against hydrogen vehicles. Or in buildings, we can use heat pumps instead of hydrogen boilers, but really focus the hydrogen deployment on those sectors where there is no alternative. Industry clearly is a major sector that will need lots of hydrogen, already uses lots of hydrogen, but it's currently based on fossil fuels. And then also, of course, we will need at least some form of hydrogen derivatives for shipping and possibly aviation too. So I think that is an important part of the debate. I think it's directly connected to the more upstream discussion around the leakage and the global warming impacts of hydrogen. So I hope we can use this as an encouragement to have a much more nuanced debate about this topic, which I think is desperately needed, given that we are far behind. The latest data I saw from Bloomberg New Energy Finance just this morning suggests that there's about 10% of buyers for the capacity plan for 2030 for hydrogen production. So we have a real problem, I think, to make sure we actually get the deployment right. And this topic of emissions, I think, just amplifies the need for that.
Thank you, Jan. The deployment and the investment, we're going to come to that a little bit later on, but let's start now with technology and data. And Steve, you spoke a bit about this, but let's drill down a little bit. What data is needed and what technology do we have available? You mentioned Airdyne, working with them, in terms of scalability and accuracy as well. So let's start with the data. What data is needed?
Well, we need data on just understanding how much hydrogen is lost along the value chain. So if you're using a hydrogen vehicle, just the fact that you have to put hydrogen from some kind of container system where it's held at the fueling station into the vehicle, and then you're using the vehicle on the roads, which are rough, how much is lost? We don't have nobody has any estimate of that. And we don't have data in the when you do electrolysis, how much is vented? There are various opinions. You ask people, they give you a lot of different impressions. We need that data. So while I agree with most of what Jose said about his comments, where I disagree is we found with methane, and where I think it's applicable, is that until we measured, people didn't realize how their systems actually operated. They were losing product, and they would tell you they're not because it was worth not losing, or they designed the system. We're pretty confident that's happening. What we can't do, and we can all take bets, is how much of it is being lost. So we have this one new instrument coming out of Airdyne that allows us to make those measurements accurately and quickly using really good science. We've demonstrated that at METEC with third parties. And we're now working with the industry to make those measurements broadly. So we need that data. We need it quickly. And I think then that will just, as Jan said, just sort of amplify the distinctions between those places where using hydrogen makes sense and where those really don't.
Steve, on the technology side as well, what are we looking at the same type of technology being deployed in all sectors? Or, for example, you mentioned cars. Do we need a different type of technology, which is maybe a part of the car to monitor this? Whereas if you're testing pipelines, there's a different approach. How do you see the technology in principle expanding?
Well, I think we again, I would look to methane where a dozen years ago, we didn't have that diversity of technology that could be used in specific applications. We don't have that for hydrogen now. I just spoke with someone a couple of days ago when I was at Massachusetts Institute of Technology talking about somebody who thought they were developing it. So we need a rich ecosystem of new technology so that we can monitor it more closely in a diversity of locations. Currently, that's not possible.
Okay. Jose, you spoke about the need for scientific clarity and evidence gathering here as well. What are you looking for in terms of research programs and that's there now and that need to be funded, that need to be instigated as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so I think on in terms of research, Steve has just mentioned what is critical, which is work on the researchers where they can collect and create robust data sets on how much hydrogen leaks in every kind of single equipment. I think this is of paramount importance. I agree in that we have basically no information on this, and I think it's going to be also particularly challenging because we are moving, or it seems that we are going to be moving from a system in which we produce and use hydrogen in the same place to a system in which we are going to produce hydrogen in one place, but then using it somewhere else. And we are going to be creating supply chains with new ways of transporting it, compressors, moving into tanks, even maybe filling them in I hope not in small cars, at least, but the risk is there. But perhaps in trucks, we can think in many other applications. And for all these things, we have simply no clue. And the thing is that we don't know. Not only we don't have clue, is that we don't have even any kind of standard already available for these kind of things. So I think it's not only on the technological side. We also need pre-normative research to inform standards that then at some point can inform the regulatory part, which will be the next step and probably the most challenging one.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jan, we don't really know what's happening. The suspicion's there that there's leakage. The scale of it's not known. The European Commission has a hydrogen strategy. We've got the hydrogen bank, all these different dynamics. Is everything going a little too fast? Should there be a pause here until it's better understood what's happening with hydrogen, that the near-term and long-term implications could off-balance the whole objective?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think we know already that the world uses about 100 million tons of hydrogen, and 99% plus of that hydrogen, and these are numbers from the IEA, are currently from fossil fuels, unabated, mainly from gas, also from coal. That needs to be replaced. It's very difficult to replace most of that with alternatives because it's non-energy users, things like fertilizer production, where we will need hydrogen. So clearly, low carbon hydrogen, ideally green hydrogen, needs to be available to replace that. So for me, that's a very clear no regret option. And even just scaling your current green hydrogen production to those sort of levels requires a massive investment in new infrastructure, and there are huge challenges ahead. I think we don't need to pause. I think we should take a step back and really think about some of the areas that previously have been hyped, also by parts of the industry, as having huge potential for hydrogen use. I think the data that we're now getting, and also the slow pace that we're seeing, I mean, we're not seeing the cost reductions, we're not seeing the upscale in deployment that we were promised, I think should give us some food for thought and reassess to what extent it is realistic, and really focus on the no regret options for now. Make sure we do that well, and then take it from there, rather than think about the entire economy and see hydrogen as a silver bullet. I mean, in the latest net zero 2050 roadmap from the IEA, I think hydrogen takes about 10% of the global final energy use as a share. So it's an important energy carrier in the scenario, but it's not the majority of final energy use, and we should always look at it in that way. It's a niche application where there is no other alternative available, rather than an abundant energy carrier that can be used everywhere for all sorts of things. That clearly doesn't make sense from an economic perspective, but it also doesn't make sense, I think, increasingly as we see from a global warming perspective.
Okay, thank you. Steve, if we were to say during the next 5 years, what's the most suitable policy measure to limit hydrogen emissions, what would your top choice be? I'll ask the other two gentlemen as well. So in the next 5 years, what's possible to limit the emissions?
Yeah, I won't speak to policy, but I will speak to the practicalities of it. And I would just agree with Jan. I mean, we need to focus on those places that no regrets. So replacing existing hydrogen with low impact hydrogen is a no regrets. And that's going to take a lot of work and effort. And the key is thinking about this as learning, right? What we want to do is take these new developments and make sure we're monitoring, we're learning from them so that we can integrate those learnings as we go along. If we do that, it's a win-win for everyone. But we have to make a commitment to do that. We can't just deploy and then kind of think about it after the fact.
All right. Jan, same question in terms of policy opportunities. What would you put on the table right now?
Well, I think there's one question about why is there so little uptake. I think that's one, and the other question, I guess, is how do we make sure we manage the impacts of hydrogen on global warming that we just discussed. And I think that the two are quite separate in terms of policy. I think Jose alluded to some of the policies that may be needed to make sure we do not have global warming impact from hydrogen in the way that Steve described, which could be fairly significant. I think the other question is, how do we ensure hydrogen uptake actually happens? How do we create a demand driver? I mean, the main reason why hydrogen buyers are not coming forward is that it's more expensive. It's cheaper to burn fossil fuels or to use gray hydrogen or black hydrogen than using green hydrogen or blue hydrogen. So changing the dynamics on the demand side in that way, to me, seems very, very critical. A lot of the discussion in Europe has focused on production. How do we produce more hydrogen or import more hydrogen? But I think we haven't spent enough time yet on thinking about how we actually create the right conditions to stimulate hydrogen demand in those sectors where we know it's going to be desperately needed. So I think that is, for me, a really important question for policymakers to address the demand side much more and not just focus on supply. I think giving subsidies for the production of clean hydrogen is one thing, but I think the other question is really how do you make sure you stimulate demand in the right areas where we know we're going to need lots of hydrogen and need to replace especially existing hydrogen uses that are pretty carbon intensive.
Thank you. Jose, same question. One policy option on the table for the next 5 years. What would you choose?
Thanks. So I think Jan has just stepped on the one that I was going to mention, which is the issue of demand, because I think we have, as he said, to differentiate two things. One is concretely on the hydrogen leakage part, but also on the deployment, because there are some uses in which we are going to need hydrogen, same as we are needing other things that have certain warmer potential, but that we cannot get rid of them in our life. It's not the use of replacing fossil fuels. So I think the demand side, actually, we did a lot of analysis in our latest global hydrogen review specifically on this point and prepare some recommendations on the adoption, things like quotas and mandates on those sectors where we don't have any alternative to hydrogen. And these are fertilizers and methanol production and things like that. And then I think on the other side, I think that the policy work on hydrogen leakage has to go through innovation and research policies. We really need to build that evidence base, and I think there should be ways to incorporate that innovation angle in all the programs for the support of low emission hydrogen production, and also the creation of specific research programs for building the evidence base. So for me, these are like the two angles: stimulate the demand side on the no regret options first, and then we will see on the other options, which could be more controversial, where the technology brings us, and then stimulate research and innovation on leak detection and understanding how much hydrogen leaks.
Thank you. Jan, you mentioned subsidies earlier, but stimulating the market in this case as well. What do you think? What do you think will really get the market moving in terms of both sides of the supply and demand? Is this just about providing subsidies to close that investment gap? Do we need different types of underwriting to enable those who are capable of expanding to scale to get into the market faster? How do you see this?
I mean, there's many options available, and what's appropriate will depend on the specific context. But just to give you a few examples, I mean, of course, you could require a certain degree of emission reduction for specific sectors, or even an increasing share of green and blue hydrogen if you wanted to do that of any hydrogen that's being used. So essentially, you have a performance standard that gets tightened over time, and that will drive demand. That's one way. Or you use carbon pricing and apply that. I mean, we have the European emissions trading system, of course, but you could also think about something that's a little bit more targeted to really stimulate demand for clean hydrogen in the sectors where we know it's going to be needed. This hasn't been done before, of course, with hydrogen. This is a pretty new field where we haven't had lots of policy activity in the past, but we have done this, of course, in the power sector very successfully, and we've also done it no more recently for car manufacturing and introduced performance standards that have to be met. So something similar along these lines will be required, I think, if we really want to scale up quickly. Of course, the question then becomes about the competitiveness of certain sectors, and that's a major concern for policymakers. Will we then drive out certain industry sectors to places where perhaps those standards are not in place? But clearly, without anything, it's not going to happen fast enough, and it's not going to happen at the scale needed.
Thank you for that. Steve, can you explain just a little bit about what the opportunities would be where it comes to financing this market, because you're dealing with larger scale businesses and not necessarily going to the consumer, to the individual user as well? Does that make it easier to raise the money in this kind of market?
Well, again, I'm going to talk about what I know, which is how do we finance and how do we get to having the technology necessary to do this well. And there, I think it's really demonstrating that we have a market. Again, we need to match the supply and demand. And again, I'm going to pull from the methane example. When we started looking at methane emissions associated with the natural gas value chain, there were no technologies for most companies to monitor their emissions in any reasonable way. So we actually got some companies to say that we'll buy technology if you can produce it, and went out to the technology company, said, look, there's a market, why don't you produce it? So we have to create a whole ecosystem of being able to get the right measurements, not just create the physical objects, but even some of those aren't there. We have to think about things as mundane as compressing. You can't just take a natural gas compressor station, use it for hydrogen, and not expect it to emit a lot. So you have to worry about slippage. So we need to create a much more robust market for all the elements we need in the ecosystem if we're going to deploy hydrogen. And as Jan said, we shouldn't just be thinking about production credits. We need to have the offtake capacity, and we need to have everything in between to do it well. That ecosystem is still just emerging, and we need to think about it in a much more robust way than historically governments had. And I think if we do that, we'll start to see some really rapid engagement from a wider range of players, which will allow us to do that. I mean, if I just think about the work we're doing with Aerodyne, we had to spend, we worked with them hard to demonstrate to them that it was worth their investment in creating this instrument, that there were folks out there who really needed it, because that demand was not clear.
Okay, thank you. Jose, you spoke a lot about research and development as well, which is timely, time-consuming, it's costly. And then we're in the context of a timeline for carbon reduction, for greenhouse gas reduction, that's really tight. How do you accelerate that R&D pipeline? Where does the money need to come from? And back to what Steve was saying as well, how do you get the investors to really commit to this in the short term and to get the uptake? Because if you wait 10 years to this, 20 years, and then start deploying technology, it's perhaps too late.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I am going to be a bit disruptive with the question and question actually your first statement that in research it takes a lot of time. Research takes a lot of time because normally they don't have the resources to do it. And we have seen with the development of the COVID vaccine that when they really receive what they need, they act fast. So we have plenty of really smart people that can find great solutions. So I think the first thing is to provide the resources that they need to create this evidence-based. But and actually going back to some of the points that Jan and Steve have mentioned, so we are speaking, if we start speaking about these large consumers of hydrogen that we already exist to date, they have the capability to create the market for all these kind of things. So taking the example of Steve about the compressor, so you were not going to put hydrogen in a compressor that a methane compressor because it's leak, also because it cannot operate in the same way, so it's going to break down at some point. But it's not easy to find a lot of producers of hydrogen compressors, or compressors that can be used only with hydrogen. And that's because there's not yet a market. So if you really take all these things, because one of the big challenges of scaling this market is that we are building completely new supply chains that we have never built before. So they are facing a lot of challenges on the demand side, on the production side, we have already mentioned, but also on the regulatory side, on the availability of infrastructure. So using these big flagship projects that are going to be funded at the beginning, and asking them to take action on this front, on the implementation of these type of tools, engaging with developers of this type of tools, so they can test, they can improve them, and they can create this scale for that market. I think it is needed, and I think for these really large projects, asking them to start some testing, some data collection, is a minor additional cost on the project. So we are speaking about projects that are on the hundreds of millions, and we are speaking about really small amounts for a research group to go there and to test their tools and to collect this data. And then apart from that, we need transparency as well. And taking the example of methane that Steve mentioned, for many years we didn't have any transparency. If we can say that we have it now on the methane emission from industry, and then we can see completely different estimates from international organizations like us or from academia, from compared with what industry reports. No, so I think these are two things in which we have to think how they can create the scale for this type of tools, but also how we can ensure transparency on their side.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to come to those in just a second. But Steve, I just want to ask you, in terms of United States and Europe and in comparison of perspectives, does Europe deal differently with the market making here, the regulatory framework compared to the United States, or is there a difference in development and maturity of this approach?
Well, I'm going to sort of build off of what Jose said to indirectly start to get to your answer. So he mentioned about the fact of COVID, and metaphors are always challenging. But if you look at actually a little closer at COVID, what happened is there was a very large amount of investment made by government before COVID vaccines came out. So they had a platform of knowledge they could build off of, and that was what they used to get such a rapid development. And I agree with them, you know, where there's a will, you can push things a lot faster. But we aren't seeing that commitment in government right now for these issues that we're talking about. They're not developing the science, they're not developing the technology. There's a little bit of investment in Europe and the US, and that's about it. We need a lot more of it. We need to recognize, again, that we have to create that platform where we have the knowledge, that we have the researchers doing it to allow us to then rapidly deploy it and make those investments. There are some differences in terms of the approaches, but they're really in the infancy in terms of the technology and the science and that foundational piece in both Europe and the US. And I would certainly push, as I have in both places, that we need to catalyze much more rapid investment so that you can meet what the sort of vision that Jose describes, which is that we can quickly adapt as we learn more in developing these new technologies. It is a bit of a chicken and the egg, and we need leadership from government to put that investment so that all of these, both practical, how do you build a compressor better? Some people are trying, but it's still in its infancy. We can't afford that. If we're going to get rapid decarbonization and we're going to use hydrogen in the right places in the right ways, we need that kind of investment in more of the technology, not just in the subsidies in the production or even on the demand side.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions, so instead of putting each of the questions to each of you, I'll first of all ask if either of you would like to take the question principally, and then see who else wants to follow up as well. So Jasmine Cooper from Imperial College London, question for Steve. Are there tools, technologies readily available now to detect and measure hydrogen, and would there be issues in detecting, measuring hydrogen emissions when hydrogen is injected into gas or biogas streams? You answered partly already, I think. So go ahead.
So I'll take Sure. I'll take the second part of the question. No, there's no problem. We can do joint measurements of hydrogen and methane. We've actually done those with the Aerodyne instrument in some testing of a beta instrument at the METEC facility in Colorado that the Department of Energy created. So we used known amounts of methane and combinations of methane, hydrogen, and then hydrogen alone, and it can do it very well. So I think that's very doable. With the Aerodyne instrument, we hope. I'm a big fan. I talk to anybody who wants to talk about new technology, about finding more technologies. I don't think we're finding that we can take the last decade of development in how we measure methane. There are differences, but it applies really effectively. So you can take the models that have been developed, the observation systems that have matured, and you can bring those to hydrogen. We'll be testing it this year across industrial settings as well. But I am very confident, based on the early results, that we'll be able to do this very rapidly, and to Jose's earlier point, be able to really deploy it much quicker than people might imagine. But we need the commitment both from the companies, we're seeing a lot of it, but we need more of it, and we need commitment to produce more instruments.
Okay, thank you. Question from AK. Regarding the combustion of H2, for example, substitution of fossil gases, are there any implications regarding emissions? And does combustion of H2 lead to higher nitrogen dioxide emissions? Who's up for that? Jan.
Well, I'm not an emissions expert I think what is clear is that hydrogen is sometimes described as the only product that it will release is water, and that's clearly not the case. If you combust hydrogen, there are NOx emissions, and I think it's important to be aware of that. There's different papers on the quantity of the NOx emissions and how they compare to burning fossil gas. But I think the important point is there are NOx emissions, and they of course are harmful, especially when, for example, hydrogen is used for cooking. There still be NOx emissions, or when you burn hydrogen in cars or boilers in a city environment, that still causes the same problems as NOx emissions from combusting fossil fuels. But maybe it's a question for Steve or Jose to answer as to whether the NOx emissions are higher or lower. I don't want to make a call on that. I think Jose and Steve are much more qualified to answer that.
Thank you. Jose or Steve, quick response to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to complement. So, and actually, I'm going to take again a point raised, I think, by the three of us, which is to use hydrogen in the right places and link it to this point. Yes, the NOx emissions on hydrogen combustion are higher than in the case of natural gas, because hydrogen flame takes place at higher temperatures, and that results in higher NOx emissions. And taking the point of Jan or of the issue of using hydrogen in boilers or in cooking appliances, that's a health issue, and that's a clear example on places in which we have better alternatives to hydrogen, and we should not be using it. It should be kind of the last case scenario if really we cannot deploy electric heating in these cases. So the issue of hydrogen generating NOx can be much more easily addressed when we have a large turbine for regenerating backup power, which is still questionable if hydrogen is the best alternative. Probably not, but again, I think is an area in which we could have a bit more debate, and I will be a bit more in favor than in the case of buildings. But in that case, you can really deal with those NOx emissions. We already have the technologies to address those emissions and minimize them. But we don't have the technology for minimizing those emissions in cookers or in small boilers at home. So there is a clear example in which we should not prioritize the use of hydrogen. It should be the last resource in certain cases in which we really cannot use all the other cleaner and more efficient and less costly alternatives.
All right. Thank you. A question from Alex Barnes. Given we are unlikely to hit net zero by 2050, will the short-term effects of hydrogen leakage make things worse? And what does that mean for how and when we deploy hydrogen? Steve.
Sure. So it really depends. I mean, this is the problem. I can't give a straight answer. It depends on where you're using it, how much your emissions are, how you're producing the hydrogen. And right now we don't have enough data to say, will it decrease the the value and make the path harder? Not necessarily worse than fossil fuels. Absolutely. And how much worse is the challenge. So we can't afford that. That's why we've really focused on how do we quantify it and then minimize those losses so that we can maximize the decarbonization potential. And I think all of us are saying that. We want to use hydrogen and we have to use it in the right places in the right way. And to do that, we have to get the hydrogen down, and we have to do it quickly so that we can use hydrogen between now and 2050 to be an effective tool in the arsenal that we have.
Thank you. Question from Michelle. Jose, maybe you want to take this one. Michelle Tynan from Global Agriculture Methane Manager, EDF. Do you think hydrogen production from biomethane created in anaerobic digesters on livestock farms makes sense? Economically, it might only make sense with upcoming US incentives or tax credits, but what about ecologically?
Well, I think that's one of the clear examples of if you do it right, it could be. If you do it wrong, it's going to be terrible. Because we are starting from anaerobic digestion of products to produce methane, and that's I mean, we have similar to the case of natural gas experiences in which we started deploying this technology without really not understanding the consequences. So I still remember, actually, I started working on this technology when I finished the university, and I remember to visiting facilities in which this was done in open ponds. So basically, we were releasing tons and tons of methane freely into the atmosphere. So this is a clear example that if we do things right and we understand the science behind of everything that we do, we are most likely to do things right. So I think if we produce it from biomethane that is produced on closed ponds, using the best available technologies to minimize, if not completely avoid, methane emissions from all the biogas plants, then we use it to produce hydrogen in an adequate equipment, minimizing, so implementing leak detection and repair techniques and protocols and methodologies. That could make sense. But if we don't take all these measures from the very beginning, it could be an absolute disaster from the ecological point of view.
Thank you. Excellent answer. And a question from Alexandre Colombier. From AFNO, the French standardization body in Senelec, and ISO IEC. Long title. Thank you, Alexander. Would there be a need to standardize ways of quantifying, measuring these emissions on the value chain? Mr. Regulatory Expert. Jan, over to you for that one.
I think ultimately, yes. I think it's going to be important that there's a degree of standardization and reliability. So we know what kind of emissions are associated with hydrogen, depending on the source and where it's from. I mean, we know also, of course, using an analogy of the Dieselgate scandal, that just by having standards and testing doesn't necessarily guarantee that you get the results that you want. So I think we need to learn the lessons from that and make sure the data is reliable. Of course, we also know from satellite data that some of the methane emissions that are being reported on the ground do not match what we can see with satellite data. So there's a discrepancy there too. So I think, yes, we do need a degree of standardization and to make sure we have reliable data and can compare and contrast between different types and sources of hydrogen.
Thank you. Question for Steve from Johannes Hamp. Steve, by when do you expect to have first results from measurements that can be publicly shared, and which applications will you first focus on? Johannes is from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Thanks for the question. Steve.
Yeah, so I can't give you an exact time. We're working as fast as we can. I would hope that we can present some results by the end of this coming year, 2024, because we do need to make sure we go through rigorous peer review. But I would hope we could get something out that quickly. It'll depend a little bit on how smoothly the deployment of the instrument and our learnings go. We're working with, as I mentioned, a group of different academics, both in the United States and in Europe, and we're having talks in Asia as well. But our goal is to get it out absolutely as fast as we can. but we will not put the data out without it being peer reviewed first.
Thank you. And for Steve also, do we get the slides afterwards? Peter Schillart asks.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And most of that is presented in a paper Lisa Acco and myself published in 2022. You can find it in the journal Atmospheric Physics and Chemistry.
Thank you. The presentation link is at the top there. You can see it. Thank you to Anna for that. And then we go to a question from Mark de Frenes. So this discussion focus on the no regret strategy confirms that the P2P vision, green renewable power, hydrogen storage, power by burning hydrogen, is dead. Good to confirm it once for all. Is that correct? Steve, Jan?
Well, I go ahead.
Jose?
So I would just, yeah.
No, it's just if you could repeat the question, because I didn't understand the whole thing. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So this discussion, the focus on the no regret strategy. Mark says it confirms that the P2P vision of green renewable power, hydrogen storage, and power by burning hydrogen is dead. Can you confirm that once and for all?
Okay, Steve, if you want to kick off, I'm happy to complement.
All right. Well, I think we have to be careful about those absolutes, and Jose mentioned it.
Sure.
The degree to which it's a backup for renewables during a Dunkelflaute or some other period, I think we still don't know. It's one of the options. We can debate whether it's a viable. I think it's going to depend, right? Geography, the system stability and the availability varies enormously across geographies. And so I think we have to be a little careful in making categorical statements. I would not be looking for hydrogen as a primary power source at scale, but I do think that we still need to look at this option of using it as a, for lack of a better term, storage mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Anything else to add there? Okay,
yeah, well, I just wanted to say exactly the same point, and I think Steve brought the key element here, which is the differences in depending on the geography. So, and just to give you a number from the IEA, when we look at our net zero emission scenario, we see that the role of hydrogen in power generation is practically minimal. I think it's less than 2% or less than 1.5%, which is minimal, but still in some regions it can play a more significant role than that 1%.
Okay, Delia Villagrasa asks, what about using H2 for RE storage to compensate for seasonal RE production variability? Could you explain your views on the role of H2 for that? Delia is a climate and energy consultant at the Lead Cool Heating Coalition. Who wants to go with that?
Related to the previous one, it's exactly the same point. No, depending on the geography, it can play a role and it can be important. And another aspect that I wanted to mention, maybe that role will be minimal, but when we take into account how much hydrogen demand that can create, that's important, because if we see the share of hydrogen demand of power generation in our scenarios is not negligible. Whereas its role in generating that power is quite negligible. So I think we have to take an approach here on 2 points. What's the role on that, and how large can be the business that role of hydrogen in power generation can create?
Thank you. Jan, question for you. Alex Barnes, independent consultant, said, what are the panel's views on current hydrogen standards in terms of greenhouse gas accounting, for example, in the EU, UK, and US?
Brian, could I just come in on the
sure,
latter
please.
question? The question from the previous, I don't know who asked the question, but I think from my perspective, it's going to be important to have some form of dispatchable generation. That's very clear in all of the modeling that's been done on decarbonizing the power sector. And for seasonal storage, I don't think there are that many options right now on the table. And hydrogen clearly looks as a very promising option. So I don't think it's dead. I think we still need to look into it. But of course, it's not commercialized yet. To my knowledge, there is no single commercially operating power plant in the world that runs on 100% hydrogen. So we need to make sure we can actually get the technology to do what it's supposed to do. But I think there's clearly a role there potentially for hydrogen to not to provide bulk power, but to really help balance a more variable supply side in the power sector.
Thank you. And question to Steve. Is there any initiative to fight hydrogen emissions and standardize hydrogen measurements such as OGMP 2.0 or methane guiding principles? Steve?
I'm not aware of any right now. Obviously, I think this was talked about before. We would, I think Jan mentioned that. I could envision that coming soon. But we need to learn a lot more. We have to get more data. That's why I was somewhat equivocal on exactly when the data will come out. As we do make measurements, we'll learn more. As we learn more, we figure out how to do it better. And we have to go through that process. We could not design a system right now and have confidence in it. And so we have to go through that effort. And I think what we can learn from OGMP 2.0 and methane guiding principles is that we need that kind of system, and we need to, across both countries and different use cases and different providers, we need to start thinking about how we would develop that and bring that into existence at some time in the not too distant future.
Okay, thank you. Question from Raluca Petcu from the Bankwatch Romania Association to Jan, first of all. The EU hydrogen strategy sees its electricity production and heating after 2030. Also, the taxonomy criteria states that gas PP should be hydrogen ready. How do you see this in the light of your intervention to limit the use, to limit impact?
Well, I think hydrogen readiness is a pretty fluid concept. And for example, if you install hydrogen-ready boilers in buildings instead of installing technologies that already reduce carbon today, there's a clear risk that hydrogen will never come along and you're just going to continue to emit. On the other hand, we just talked about the power sector here and the potential role of hydrogen. Clearly, it's going to be important that any new gas-fired generation that we build to make sure we move that towards a place where it could burn hydrogen in larger quantities and ideally 100%. So it really depends, I think, on the application that we're talking about, whether hydrogen readiness makes sense. But just under the label of hydrogen readiness to construct lots of new fossil fuel infrastructure, I think is a very dangerous strategy because it relies on availability of hydrogen at a certain price. And I have my doubts whether we can get an abundance of cheap hydrogen in the way that I think some people in the industry hope. And I think there's also, of course, and that's important, I think, it's not just a scientific debate. There are clearly vested interests at play here too. The companies that currently have an existing business model around fossil fuels, to some extent, have pushed hydrogen because it's a lifeline to extend the lifetime of the assets a little longer. So we have to disentangle some of those arguments that are clearly self-interested from the scientific analysis here.
Thank you. Question from Mike Parr. The use of H2 to decarb agricultural machinery, are you really going to use batteries, he asks? Seems one of the most obvious applications. A niche application? No. For agricultural machinery, no agricultural machinery, no food. Jose, any quick comments on that?
Yeah, I can say that one actually is one of the areas where we have seen some companies trying to adapt existing agricultural machinery to use hydrogen. It's one of the very difficult ones to electrify, but it's not a massive business, and that sometimes creates a problem. I mean, going back to the case of cars, although I think everyone in the call agrees that hydrogen cars is not the way to go. But it's one of the sectors that actually can create scale, and that's why some companies have focused on that. But in agricultural machinery, is not that easy to create that scale. You don't have millions of machines in every country, so that's one of the challenges. And it's actually a challenge that can be replicated in practically every reasonable use of hydrogen derivatives in transport. So we don't have millions of big ships around the world. We don't have millions of planes machines where we can use hydrogen derivatives. So that's one actually of the big technological challenges that many of these hydrogen technologies, even making a lot of sense, may face in the near future.
Okay, Mike, a follow-up question. Maybe you want to take that as well, Jose. Why do H2 projects need to be large scale? He says, I'm doing one now that is MW class and local, using local renewables, and the H2 will be used locally for transport and heating. Do we need to go big scale, Jose?
We need to go big scale, not for transport and heating. I don't want to be repetitive, but we really need to go big scale, because one of the key challenge that's today low emission hydrogen, call it blue or green, with the real challenge that they are facing is the cost gap with their unabated alternatives. And the only way to start closing that gap, well, of course, is the policy action. With policy action, we can and facilitating finance, that's an option, but also scaling up the technology. So if we produce some small electrolyzers, almost handmade in a small workshop, it's going to be way more costly than producing big machines in completely automatized and optimized large scale manufacturing facilities. So that's the reason why we need to go big scale. Of course, this has to be done progressively. We cannot install tomorrow 1, 2, 3 gigawatts of electrolysis in any plant. We need to learn how to do that. The largest electrolyzers in the world have never gone beyond 100 megawatts. Well, very in the past in certain uses, but that business model is not yet anymore. So that we need a challenge, but we really need to create that scale and go big.
Okay, thank you. Another couple of questions, and then we're going to go to our wrap-up fairly soon. If you have a final question, please send it in right now. We don't have much more time left. Eva Hennig asks, Steve, natural hydrogen could be a source in the future. What is your opinion on mining it to also reduce any emissions occurring from these deposits? Steve?
Well, certainly that's something that we need to be looking at, but we're still in very, very early days. So there's a lot of, it doesn't come pure by a long shot. In many cases, it's the minority component that you can find. Separating it, controlling it, mining it is all a lot of unanswered questions. It's something we certainly should be looking at, because of the embodied energy, of course, would be avoided, but it is not a given that we'll be able to produce it at the scales that make a difference. I do want to jump in on the last answer that Jose made, just to add to it. We have to be really careful when we talk about deploying hydrogen in these cases, let's say with the transport of the housing, because if we look at the alternative case for that, where we take those same green electrons and we use them for those two uses, what you'll find is the rate of decarbonization goes down much dramatically. So that the hydrogen is actually not the best option in that case by a lot, by multiples. And we often don't apply that kind of rigorous thinking to make sure that, in fact, we're not creating slower rates of decarbonization. And the key here is that time matters. We have to do this quickly. We have to use hydrogen to get quick answers, and we have to use these systems. And we have to avoid ending up getting stuck on the individual tool, in this case, hydrogen, and in the process doing slowing things down.
Thank you. Just a quick comment if anybody wants to on this remark by Jenny Semolo, and which just disappeared off my screen. And I'll come back to that in a second. So Antonio Vulpio asks, will the construction of latest generation hydrogen pipelines made of thermoplastic materials contribute to the mitigation of hydrogen leakage emissions into the atmosphere as part of the safe transportation of hydrogen in pipelines? Who wants to have a go at that? Jose.
Well, I am happy to start. I think building from what we have said from the very beginning, we don't have evidence. We don't know how much hydrogen leaks on pipes. It seems that these new materials enhanced will be better, but we don't have an evidence to support that. But obviously, if they are designed to operate with hydrogen, they will probably materials well more adapted to hydrogen than steel pipes that can suffer from many other things that can actually end up promoting leakage. So I will say it's very, 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 very probable, but I don't have enough scientific evidence to say yes, for sure, this is better.
Okay, thank you. A quick comment for any of you on Jenny's remark, which is Aren't there already hydrogen quantification measurements being performed within pilot projects? For example, the German project H2 Infra did permeation testing H2 distribution pipelines and service lines and hydrogen leakage measurements on flange connections at a reducing and metering station. Anybody able to comment on that?
Happy to jump in. So there may be some individual measurements of existing exposed pieces of equipment, because you can go very close to it and then can try and determine it with slow response instruments. We know from methane, which we've demonstrated, those measurements will not give us a good indication of the system level losses. And there's no reason to believe. So that's useful, but it's by no means gives us the data that we really understand what the losses are from any kind of system level and in normal natural conditions. So most pipes, if you talk about pipes, are buried. If we're talking about distribution, we need to look at them in a buried environment. We need to look at industrial processes where they're working as part of an industrial production system. Those are the kinds of measurements we do not have. We have very small scale individual component measurements. Useful, but not very insightful.
Okay, thank you. Our last question, this one goes to Jan. Would more regulation from Radai Kajais? Would more regulation on especially blue H2 production help to give more incentives for green H2 production?
I would think yes, it would, because it would, well, it depends how the green hydrogen is being produced, of course, but if it was zero emissions green hydrogen just from renewable sources, of course, there's a premium for lower carbon content, lower carbon emissions associated with the hydrogen. And if you have stricter regulation on blue hydrogen, presumably that would make blue hydrogen more expensive. But of course, yeah, without actually having done this anywhere yet for a long time, it's difficult to see how it would play out in reality. But in principle, I think having regulation on blue would make green hydrogen more competitive.
Thank you. We have lots more questions. I think we've had more questions for this program than pretty much any other that I can remember in recent times. So thank you to our audience. It's amazing participation. Sorry I couldn't get to all the questions today. We're pretty much out of time as it is. I hope that's useful. Some of those questions maybe the panel can follow up individually later. So let me just go to the wrap up and ask each of you for your final remarks and the takeaways for today. Jan, you'd like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this topic of the global warming impact of hydrogen is pretty new, right? It's not something we've discussed for a very long time, and I think it's an important part of the debate we had about hydrogen, which I don't think should lead to the conclusion that we should never deploy green hydrogen or blue hydrogen. I think it really, supports the argument I made early on in my contribution, I think, to this debate today, that a very nuanced and evidence-led approach is the right approach, rather than one that sees hydrogen as the solution for all of the problems that we're trying to solve. And I think we're moving towards that gradually now that reality hits the ground.
Thank you so much. Jose?
Yeah, I think my final remark will go on the topic of we need action on this, and we need to increase our efforts, and that goes from the private sector. We have discussed some options, but also on the government sector. On the government action, we really need to facilitate and provide resources for the research, for development, for innovation of techniques, of technologies, of methodologies. And it's important now because, as I said, I don't think we are going to see a significant impact of hydrogen, but this is just a gut feeling. I cannot back up with evidence because I don't have the evidence to say that or the contrary. And when we are going to address this massive problem of the climate change, and we need to scale these technologies in such a short time, we need to make well-informed, evidence-informed decisions. So I think my final remark is a bit of begging governments to put the programs in place and to put the research efforts in place, and the industry to take this seriously, because I think their image can be at stake if they don't do it, and then we find ourselves in 10-year time in a dramatic situation.
Thank you so much. Steve, last word.
Well, I would just endorse what Jan and Jose said. We really do need to make sure that we get the investments in the work so that we can make the right decisions, deploy hydrogen in effective places, and understand where it's not going to be an effective tool. To do that, we need data, and we need to recognize that we need to do all of this quickly, as we talked about. We need to make decarbonization the problem of today, not of tomorrow, but we can't do that unless we make the investments now in getting the data and ensuring we make effective decisions. And I think we're all in alignment on that.
Great, thank you so much. Excellent detailed discussion. Thanks to Jose, Steve, and to Jan. Our thanks also to the Environmental Defence Fund for supporting the program today. You don't see them, but they're here right in front of me in the studio and behind us as well in the office here. Anna and Juliette, the preparation for the production teams today, with Pablo, Zoran, and Wilson here on technical production in the studio. And our social media team, somewhere just behind me, are right here as well. So thanks to our audience for super participation. We really value your content today as well. I'm Brian Maguire. Good afternoon.